The industrial district was quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnerving rather than peaceful. The air carried the faint stench of oil and rust, remnants of the area's past as a manufacturing hub. Now, most of the warehouses and factories stood abandoned, their walls crumbling and windows shattered. The occasional flicker of a dim streetlight barely illuminated the cracked pavement, littered with forgotten scraps of metal and shards of glass. It was the kind of place most people avoided after dark, a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, filled with an unspoken sense of foreboding. Into this desolate space walked Kira Williams, her figure silhouetted against the faint glow of a distant city skyline. She was dressed inconspicuously in a reflective orange safety jacket and steel-toed boots, blending seamlessly with the environment. A hard hat rested slightly askew on her head, completing the image of a worker who had no reason to attract attention. But there was nothing ordinary about her. Kira moved with a deliberate purpose, her steps confident yet quiet, her gaze sharp and vigilant. In her hand, she clutched a small digital camera, its strap wound tightly around her wrist. Every now and then she paused to snap a photo of her surroundings, a pile of freshly unloaded crates here, a forklift idling by an open warehouse door there. Each click of the shutter was quick and precise, her movements practiced to avoid detection. Kira wasn't here by accident. For months she had been working undercover, investigating a suspected network of corruption and illicit trade that thrived in this part of the city. What once had been a thriving industrial area had turned into a no-man's land, controlled by a coalition of criminal enterprises. Drugs, weapons, and human trafficking all passed through these abandoned warehouses, facilitated by individuals who wore badges and held positions of power. Kira's mission wasn't just about gathering evidence, it was personal. Her younger brother, a promising student community organizer, had disappeared in this very district 3 years ago. The police had dismissed his case as a runaway, but Kira knew better. He had been digging too deep into the wrong people's business, and now he was gone. Her investigation had led her to this particular warehouse, one that operated under the guise of legitimate storage, but was rumored to be a key hub for smuggling operations. Earlier that day, she'd intercepted a coded message about a shipment arriving tonight. It was risky to come alone, but Kira had learned to rely on herself. Trusting others, even those on her own side, wasn't an option when corruption ran so deep. As she approached the warehouse, she noticed faint traces of activity. The distant hum of engines echoed through the night, followed by the metallic clang of crates being moved. From the shadows, Kira observed workers unloading a truck under the dim light of a single floodlamp. The crates were unmarked, giving no indication of their contents, but their size and the way they were handled suggested something valuable or dangerous. She raised her camera, zooming in to capture the details, the faces of the workers, the license plate of the truck, the position of the crates. Her heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline making her hyper-aware of every sound and movement around her. Suddenly, the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping dangerously close to where she stood. Kira froze, pressing herself against the cold metal surface of a nearby container. The light lingered for a moment, then moved on, followed by the heavy footsteps of a guard patrolling the perimeter. She let out a silent breath of relief but didn't move just yet. Timing was everything, and one wrong step could mean the end of her mission and possibly her life. What Kira didn't know was that she had already been noticed. Watching from a distance, concealed in the shadows of a parked squad car, was Officer Derek Cross. Cross was a man who thrived on power, his badge granting him the authority to act with impunity. For years he had operated as both a law enforcement officer and a key player in the very criminal network Kira was investigating. His reputation for brutality was well known, especially among the vulnerable communities he patrolled. To Cross, his badge was a weapon, a shield that protected him from accountability. And tonight he had noticed someone he didn't recognize, a figure moving through his territory with a suspicious air. Cross narrowed his eyes as he watched Kira through the windshield of his car. Something about her movements struck him as odd. She wasn't stumbling around aimlessly like the vagrants who occasionally wandered into the district. She was too focused, too deliberate. He couldn't see her face clearly, but the reflective jacket she wore only made her stand out more. Cross didn't like anyone snooping around, especially not on a night like this. He knew the shipment was important, and the last thing he needed was someone drawing unwanted attention. With a grunt, he reached for his radio, considering whether to call it in, but then he stopped. Cross rarely bothered with formalities like backup or reports. He preferred to handle things his way quietly, without oversight. He adjusted the holster on his belt and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. The cool night air bittered his skin, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the figure moving near the warehouse. As he approached, his hand instinctively rested on the butt of his gun, a habit born from years of using intimidation as his first line of defense. Kira, still unaware of his presence, continued taking photos. She had moved closer to the warehouse entrance, crouching low to avoid being seen. Cross watched her for a moment, his expression a mix of suspicion and disdain. To him, she was just another person who didn't belong, a trespasser who needed to be taught a lesson. He stepped into the light, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Hey, you there! Stop what you're doing!" Kira's head snapped up, her body tensing as the flashlight's beam found her. She squinted against the harsh light, instinctively raising a hand to shield her eyes. Her mind raced, calculating her options. Running wasn't an option, he was too close, and she was too exposed. Instead, she stood slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Evening, officer," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Is there a problem?" Cross didn't lower his flashlight. Instead, he took a step closer, his free hand still resting on his gun. "You tell me. What the hell are you doing out here?" Kira forced herself to maintain eye contact, even as her heart threatened to hammer its way out of her chest. "I work here. Just checking on some inventory before the morning shift." Cross's lips curled into a smirk, though there was no humor in his expression. "Nice try. You don't look like you belong here. Show me some ID." Kira hesitated, knowing her cover was dangerously close to being blown. But she couldn't afford to falter now. Reaching slowly into her pocket, she pulled out a forged ID card, hoping it would be enough to satisfy him. Cross snatched it from her hand, his eyes scanning it briefly before looking back at her. "Funny," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "because I've never seen you around before, and I know everyone who works here." Kira's pulse quickened. She had prepared for situations like this, but nothing could fully erase the fear of being caught. "I'm new," she said, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. "Just started last week." Cross took another step closer, his face now illuminated by the flashlight. His eyes narrowed as he studied her, searching for any sign of weakness or deceit. "You're lying," he said flatly. Before Kira could respond, he grabbed her arm, his grip like a vise. "Let's take a walk," he said, dragging her toward his squad car. "We're going to find out exactly who you are and what you're doing here." Kira didn't resist, but her mind was already racing. She knew this was only the beginning of a night that would test every ounce of her resolve. The gravel crunched under Kira's boots as Officer Derek Cross dragged her toward his squad car. His grip was tight, almost punishing, as though he was deliberately trying to assert dominance. Kira forced herself to remain calm. She knew she couldn't afford to show fear or panic that would only embolden him further. Her mind raced, calculating her next move. Every step closer to his car felt like another thread tightening around her neck. Cross finally stopped near the hood of his cruiser, the dim light from a nearby street lamp casting harsh shadows across his face. His expression was one of contempt, a cruel smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You think I'm stupid?" he sneered, shoving her toward the front bumper. Kira stumbled slightly but caught herself, keeping her composure. "I already told you," she said evenly, her voice calm but firm. "I'm a worker here, just doing my job." Cross snorted, shaking his head as though her words were the punchline to a bad joke. "Do I look like an idiot to you? What kind of worker sneaks around in the middle of the night with a camera?" He reached for the small device still strapped to her wrist. Kira instinctively pulled back, but he was quicker, yanking it free with a force that nearly twisted her wrist. Cross held up the camera, inspecting it with a sneer. Well, what do we have here?" he muttered, scrolling through the photos. The images of crates, trucks, and warehouse workers filled the tiny screen, each one a piece of the puzzle she'd been carefully assembling. His smirk widened as he realized exactly what she was doing. "You're not a worker," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You're a snoop, a nosy little spy trying to dig where you don't belong." Kira didn't respond. She knew anything she said would only fuel his ego. Instead, she kept her gaze steady, watching him carefully for any sign of his next move. Cross tossed the camera onto the hood of his car with a clatter and took a step closer, invading her personal space. "You know what happens to people like you in places like this?" he asked, his tone mockingly casual. "They disappear. No one comes looking. No one cares." Kira's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm not doing anything illegal," she said firmly. "And you know it. You have no right to detain me." Cross laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the empty street. "Rights? Lady out here, I am the law. And let me tell you something, you've just made the biggest mistake of your life." Without warning, he grabbed her by the arm again and pushed her roughly against the hood of the car. The cold metal bit into her skin as he patted her down, his hands moving with unnecessary force. Kira clenched her teeth, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. He found her wallet in the pocket of her jacket and flipped it open, inspecting the fake ID she'd carefully crafted for this operation. Cross's eyes narrowed as he studied it, his suspicion growing by the second. "This doesn't look right," he muttered, tossing it aside. Then his gaze fell on her wrist, where a simple, nondescript bracelet rested. "What's this?" he demanded, grabbing her arm and twisting it to inspect the bracelet. Kira stayed silent, her mind racing. The bracelet was more than just jewelry, it was a disguised tracking device, a lifeline that could alert her team if activated. But Cross didn't seem to notice its significance. He scoffed and let go of her arm, returning his attention to her face. "You're not going anywhere until I figure out who you really are," he said, reaching for the door of his car. He opened it and motioned for her to get inside. "Let's take a little ride. Maybe by the time we're done, you'll feel like telling me the truth." Kira hesitated for a fraction of a second, considering her options. Running wasn't possible, he'd catch her before she made it 5 steps. Fighting wasn't an option either. She needed to save her strength for what might come next. Reluctantly, she slid into the passenger seat, her mind working overtime to formulate a plan. Cross slammed the door shut and rounded the car, sliding into the driver's seat with a smug grin. He didn't bother calling in the situation to dispatch. That wasn't his style. Cross preferred to handle things his way off the books, without witnesses. As the car rumbled to life, Kira subtly shifted in her seat, her fingers brushing against the bracelet on her wrist. She pressed a tiny button hidden beneath the surface, sending a silent signal to her team. It was a long shot. The signal wasn't strong, and it might not reach anyone in time, but it was her only chance. The car rolled down the desolate streets, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Cross drove in silence, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The tension in the car was suffocating, a heavy weight that pressed down on Kira's chest. Finally he spoke. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his tone laced with mockery. "Walking into my territory and thinking you can get away with it. But guts won't save you tonight." Kira didn't respond. She kept her gaze fixed out the window, watching as the familiar landmarks of the district disappeared behind them. He wasn't taking her to the police station, that much was clear. The car came to a stop in front of an old, dilapidated warehouse, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. Cross stepped out, slamming the door behind him. He walked around to her side and yanked the door open, grabbing her arm and pulling her out of the car. "Let's go," he growled, dragging her toward the building. The door creaked open, revealing a cavernous interior lit by a single, flickering bulb. The air inside was thick with dust, the floor littered with debris. Cross shoved Kira toward a rusted metal chair in the center of the room. "Sit," he barked, his voice echoing off the walls. Kira hesitated for a moment before complying, her mind racing as she took in her surroundings. As Cross paced in front of her, his boots clanging against the concrete floor, he began to speak again. "You know, I've seen a lot of people like you," he said, his tone casual but menacing. "Do-gooders who think they can come into my world and clean up the mess. But you're in over your head. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Kira met his gaze, her expression defiant. "And you have no idea who you're dealing with," she shot back, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Cross's smirk faltered for a brief moment, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. But he quickly recovered, leaning in close so that his face was just inches from hers. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice dripping with venom. He straightened up and began to circle the chair, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to tell me everything you know. Who you're working for, what you've seen, and what you were planning to do with those photos." Kira didn't respond. She knew silence would frustrate him, and she needed every advantage she could get. Cross's patience snapped. He grabbed a nearby bucket and slammed it onto the ground in front of her. Inside was a bag of cement mix and a bottle of water. Kira's stomach dropped as she realized what he was planning. "You're going to talk," Cross said, his voice cold and emotionless. "Or you're going to disappear. Your choice." As he began to mix the cement, Kira's mind raced. She knew she had to stay calm, to buy herself time. But deep down, she also knew the clock was ticking, and her window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The air inside the warehouse was heavy, stale, and reeked faintly of oil and mildew. Kira sat rigid in the metal chair, her hands clenched tightly around its armrests, as Cross worked methodically in front of her. He poured the cement mix into the bucket, the dry powder swirling up into the air before settling like a fine, ominous mist around his boots. His movements were deliberate, calculated. He was a man who had done this sort of thing before, someone who thrived on control. The rhythmic scrape of his hands mixing the cement with water was unnervingly casual, as though he were preparing for an ordinary construction job, not an act of terror. "You ever wonder what it feels like?" Cross asked, his voice calm but laced with menace. He didn't look at her as he spoke, keeping his focus on the thickening mixture. The weight of it. Cement hardens fast, you know. Once it sets, it doesn't care what's trapped inside. It just gets heavier, pulls you down. There's no fighting it. He glanced up, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. You're dead before you even hit the bottom. Kira didn't flinch. Instead, she met his gaze head-on, her expression unreadable. If there was fear, she buried it deep beneath the surface, refusing to let him see it. You talk a lot for someone who's in over his head, she said evenly. Cross's lips curled into a sneer, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, doubt, perhaps, or irritation at her refusal to break. He grabbed the bucket, lifting it with ease and placed it at her feet. You think you're tough, he said, his tone darker now. You think this is a game you can win. Leaning down, he grabbed her ankle, roughly yanking off her boot. The cold air hit her foot, but she didn't move, didn't resist. She knew that any struggle now would only give him more satisfaction. He moved to the other foot, pulling off the second boot with the same rough efficiency, then shoved both of her feet into the bucket. The gritty, wet cement oozed around her skin, cool and clammy, like the first bite of a trap closing. Kira's mind raced as she forced herself to stay calm. She knew she had to buy time. The signal from her bracelet had been sent, but she couldn't be sure it had been received. If it hadn't, then she was on her own. And if it had, well, she still needed to make it through the next few minutes alive. Cross straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants, and looked down at her with a smug sense of satisfaction. Let's talk, shall we? He said, pacing slowly around her. I want to know who you're working for, what you're after. And more importantly, how much you think you know about me. Kira tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. You really think this is going to scare me? She said. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a subtle taunt, designed to poke at his ego. You're a small fish, Cross. Just a cog in the machine. Do you think your bosses care about what happens to you if this goes south? Cross stopped mid-step, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face her. For a moment, his composure faltered, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Nice try, he said, his tone dripping with contempt. But I know how this game works. You wouldn't be here if you didn't think you could get something big out of this. You're not just another nosy reporter or an activist with a camera. You're a professional, aren't you? FBI? DEA? Who sent you? Kira didn't answer, and her silence only fueled his frustration. He leaned in close, his face inches from hers. You think I won't do it? He hissed. You think someone's going to come running to save you? Out here, it's just you and me. No backup, no cavalry, just a bucket of cement and a long drop to nowhere. She allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to tug at the corner of her lips. You're more scared than I am, she said softly. The words hit him like a slap. Cross's expression darkened, and for a moment she thought he might lash out. Instead, he stepped back, letting out a low, bitter laugh. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said. But guts don't mean much when you're at the bottom of the river. He reached into his pocket and pulled out her camera, holding it up like a trophy. Let's see what's so important that you'd risk your life for it, he said, scrolling through the images. His eyes scanned each photo, his smirk fading with each click of the button. By the time he reached the last image, his jaw was tight, his grip on the camera white-knuckled. These crates, he muttered, his voice low and angry. You're tracking the shipments. Kira remained silent, watching him carefully. She could see the gears turning in his head, the realization that she knew more than he had anticipated. He turned to face her, his eyes burning with rage. Who else have you told? He demanded. Who's seen these photos? She met his gaze, her expression calm and unwavering. You're smart, she said. Figure it out. Cross's face contorted with anger, and he slammed the camera onto the ground, shattering it into pieces. The sound echoed through the warehouse, but Kira didn't flinch. She knew the photos were already backed up and sent to a secure location. He could destroy the device, but the evidence was beyond his reach. You think you've got the upper hand, Cross growled, his voice trembling with fury. But you have no idea what you're up against. He stepped back, grabbing a nearby metal rod and slamming it against the side of the chair, inches from her head. The sound was deafening, the vibrations reverberating through the metal. Kira's ears rang, but she refused to show any sign of fear. Cross leaned in again, his voice low and menacing. Here's how this works, he said. You talk or I start pouring. And trust me, sweetheart, once this stuff hardens, there's no coming back. For the first time, Kira allowed herself to show a flicker of defiance. Do it, she said, her voice steady. You think this ends with me? Go ahead. Pour the cement, see what happens. Cross stared at her, his jaw tightening as he tried to gauge whether she was bluffing. Her calmness unnerved him, made him second-guess himself. He was used to people breaking, to fear giving him the upper hand, but Kira wasn't afraid, and that made her dangerous. As the tension between them reached a boiling point, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere outside the warehouse. Cross froze, his head snapping toward the door. Kira's heart leapt, but she forced herself to stay still, her face betraying nothing. What the hell? Cross muttered, grabbing his gun and moving toward the entrance. He peered out into the darkness, his hand tightening around the grip of his weapon. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man dressed in worn, grease-stained coveralls, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. He carried a toolbox in one hand, his posture casual, almost disinterested. Who the hell are you? Cross barked, his gun trained on the stranger. The man stopped a few feet away, raising his free hand in a gesture of surrender. Relax, he said, his voice calm and measured. I'm just the mechanic. Got a call about a busted generator. Figured I'd check it out. Cross narrowed his eyes, suspicion itched across his face. Generator's fine, he said. Get lost. The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Sure thing, he said, turning to leave. But as he walked away, his eyes briefly met Kira's, and she saw something there, a flicker of recognition, a silent message. Her pulse quickened. Help had arrived, but the game was far from over. The faint echo of the mechanic's retreating footsteps lingered in the warehouse, but for Kira, the tension only tightened. Her instincts told her this was no coincidence. The stranger's brief, calculated glance was deliberate, a signal meant just for her. But what it meant, and how much time she had before Cross unraveled the truth, remained uncertain. The danger was still immediate, the threat still very real. Cross, however, wasn't as composed. He stood at the threshold of the warehouse, gripping his gun with one hand while the other twitched nervously at his side. He glanced back at Kira, his eyes narrowing as though trying to decipher her calm demeanor. He wasn't used to this. People broke under his pressure, they begged, they panicked. But Kira, she sat there, her feet submerged in cement, staring at him as though he were just another obstacle to overcome. And that enraged him. Who the hell was that guy? Cross muttered under his breath, his voice filled with suspicion. He holstered his weapon and stormed back toward her, his boots clanging loudly against the concrete floor. You know him? He demanded, leaning down so his face was level with hers. The anger in his tone was sharp, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty, like he needed to hear her say, No, just to maintain control of the situation. Kira's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smirk. You're paranoid, Cross, she said, her voice calm but laced with subtle defiance. You've got bigger problems than a random mechanic. Cross's hand shot out, grabbing the back of her chair and yanking it forward, the metal legs screeching against the floor. You think this is a joke? He hissed. I don't know who you think you are, but I promise you, you're not walking out of here unless I get answers. Kira leaned back slightly, feigning nonchalance even as her heart raced. You're asking the wrong questions, she said coolly. But then again, I suppose that's why you're just the muscle and not the brains of the operation. The words were calculated to hit a nerve, and they did. Cross's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring as he released the chair and straightened up. He took a deep breath, as though trying to regain control of himself, and began pacing back and forth in front of her. You've got guts, he admitted grudgingly, his voice steadying. I'll give you that, but guts won't save you. I've seen people like you before thinking they can outsmart the system, thinking they can outsmart me. But you know what happens to them. He paused, turning to face her, his eyes cold and calculating. They disappear. And nobody comes looking. Kira tilted her head slightly, her gaze unflinching. You really believe that, don't you? She said. That no one will come looking for me. That no one will notice when you screw this up. She let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. You've already lost control of this situation, Cross. You just don't realize it yet. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across his face, but he quickly buried it beneath a mask of anger. We'll see about that, he growled, turning away from her. He grabbed the bucket of cement and began stirring it again, his movements more frantic now, as though trying to distract himself from the cracks she was creating in his confidence. As Cross worked, Kira subtly shifted her weight, testing the restraints that held her to the chair. They were tight, but not unbreakable. She just needed an opening, a moment when his attention was elsewhere. But before she could act, Cross spoke again. You know, I've been doing this a long time, he said, his voice calmer now, almost conversational. Long enough to know when someone's bluffing. And you're bluffing. I can see it in your eyes. Kira raised an eyebrow, her expression betraying nothing. You see what you want to see, she replied. That's your problem. You're so convinced you're in control that you miss the bigger picture. Cross slammed the bucket down in front of her, the sound echoing through the empty warehouse. And what's the bigger picture, huh? He demanded, his voice rising. That you're some kind of hero. That you're going to bring me down. Let me tell you something. Sweetheart, you're in my world now. And in my world, the only thing that matters is who's holding the gun. As if to punctuate his point, he drew his weapon and pointed it directly at her, the barrel mere inches from her face. Kira's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to remain still, her expression unreadable. She knew he was trying to intimidate her, to force her into submission. But she also knew that fear was his weapon, and she couldn't afford to give him any ammunition. You won't pull the trigger, she said quietly, her voice steady. You need me alive. If I die, you lose your leverage. Cross's hand twitched, but he didn't fire. Instead, he lowered the gun slightly, his lips curling into a sneer. You're lucky I need answers, he muttered. But don't think for a second that makes you safe. He holstered the gun and grabbed the bucket again, lifting it with a grunt. You've got one last chance to start talking, he said as he began pouring the cement around her feet. The cold, wet mixture oozed around her ankles, creeping up toward her calves. Tell me who you're working for. Now. Kira took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew this was the moment. If she didn't act now, the cement would harden, and her chances of survival would plummet. But she also knew that whatever move she made had to be calculated. She couldn't afford a mistake. "I already told you," she said, her voice calm, despite the growing weight around her legs. "You're asking the wrong questions." Cross slammed the bucket down, splattering cement onto the floor. "Enough with the games," he shouted. "You think you're so smart? Fine. Let's see how smart you are when you're at the bottom of the river." Before he could make another move, the sound of an engine revving outside the warehouse caught his attention. He froze, his head snapping toward the door. "What the hell?" The engine grew louder, followed by the sound of tires screeching to a halt. Cross grabbed his gun, his movements quick and precise, and turned to face the entrance. "Stay here," he barked at Kira, as though she had any choice in the matter. He moved toward the door, his posture tense, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. Kira watched him go, her mind racing. Whoever was outside, they were either her salvation or another complication. Either way, she needed to be ready. She shifted her weight again, testing the strength of the chair. The cement was still wet, giving her a small window of opportunity to move if she acted quickly. Cross reached the door and peered outside, his gun raised. A black SUV sat idling just a few feet away, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. Cross took a cautious step forward, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Show yourself," he barked, his voice echoing across the empty lot. For a moment there was no response. Then, slowly, the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a black leather jacket and jeans. His hands were raised, palms out, in a gesture of surrender. "Easy there," the man said, his voice calm and even. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Cross didn't lower his weapon. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. The man took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Name's Caleb," he said. "I'm just here to pick up a package." Cross's eyes narrowed, suspicion etched across his face. "Package," he repeated. "What package?" Caleb gestured toward the warehouse. "I was told to meet someone here," he said. "Guess I'm in the wrong place." Kira's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the name Caleb was one of hers. But the question remained, how much did Cross suspect? And could Caleb get them out of this alive? The tension in the warehouse was palpable, the air thick with the promise of violence. And as Cross took another step forward, his gun still trained on Caleb, Kira knew the stakes had just been raised. This was no longer just about survival, it was about winning a game that had suddenly become far more dangerous. Cross's gun remained trained on Caleb, his knuckles pale against the black handle. The air in the warehouse was tense, thick with the weight of unspoken threats. Kira sat silently in the chair, her feet still submerged in the cold, wet cement, her mind racing. Caleb had arrived right on time, but this was a razor's edge situation. One wrong move, and the entire operation would spiral out of control. "Turn around." "Hands where I can see them," Cross barked at Caleb, his voice sharp and commanding. Caleb complied, slowly raising his hands higher and turning his back toward Cross. "Easy now," Caleb said, his tone calm but steady. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Cross didn't lower the gun as he advanced, his boots crunching against the debris-littered floor. His free hand reached out to pat down Caleb, searching for weapons. Finding nothing, Cross finally lowered the weapon but kept it in his hand, ready to fire at the first sign of a threat. "What kind of package are you looking for at this hour?" Cross asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Caleb, ever composed, gave a casual shrug. "I don't know the details," he said. I was just told to show up here and pick up a shipment. Guy said it'd be easy money. I didn't realize I'd be interrupting, whatever this is. His eyes flicked to Kira for the briefest of moments before returning to Cross. The glance was subtle, but Kira caught it. Caleb was gauging the situation, trying to assess how much time they had. Cross wasn't buying it. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied Caleb's face. "You're lying," he said flatly. "Nobody just stumbles onto this place without knowing what they're walking into." Caleb let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You've got me all wrong, man. I'm just a guy looking to make a quick buck. If this is your operation, I don't want any part of it. Just let me go, and I'll be on my way." Cross's jaw tightened, his grip on the gun firm. "You're not going anywhere," he growled. "Not until I figure out who you really are." He gestured toward Kira with the barrel of the gun. "And what the hell you're doing here with her?" Kira used the moment to speak up, her voice calm but firm. "He's just a driver, Cross," she said, her eyes locked on the officer. "You're wasting your time with him." Cross turned to her, his eyes blazing with anger. "Shut up," he barked, his voice echoing off the walls. "You don't get to talk." He pointed the gun at her now, the barrel steady despite the rage simmering beneath the surface. "You're lucky I haven't dumped this whole bucket of cement over your head yet." Kira didn't flinch. "If you had any control over this situation, you wouldn't need to keep threatening me," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "You're scared, Cross. You're scared because you know you're running out of time." The words hit him like a slap, and for a moment, Cross froze. Then he turned back to Caleb, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him toward the wall. "What do you know about this woman?" he demanded. "You two working together." Caleb raised his hands defensively, his expression a mask of feigned confusion. "I've never seen her before in my life," he said. "I swear, I don't know what's going on here." Cross's eyes darted between the two of them, his paranoia mounting with each passing second. He was losing control and he knew it. But instead of backing down, he doubled down on his aggression, shoving Caleb toward the chair where Kira sat. "Sit," Cross ordered, his gun still trained on him. Caleb hesitated for a fraction of a second, then complied, lowering himself into the chair next to Kira. Cross stepped back, his gun swinging between the two of them. "Now let's try this again. Who sent you? What are you after?" Kira glanced at Caleb, their eyes meeting briefly. It was all the confirmation she needed. They were on the same page, and the time for subtlety was over. "You've already lost, Cross," Kira said, her voice calm but firm. "The shipment you're protecting. It's a decoy. The real operation is already shut down." Cross froze, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. "You're lying," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now, a crack in his confidence. "Am I?" Kira countered, her tone sharp. "Why do you think your phone hasn't gone off in the last hour? Why do you think your crew hasn't called for backup?" "They're gone, Cross. It's just you now." Cross's hand tightened on the gun, his knuckles turning white. "Shut up," he shouted, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "You don't know anything about me or my operation." Kira leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "I know enough," she said. "I know about the deals you've made, the money you've stolen, the people you've hurt. And I know it's all about to come crashing down." The tension in the room was suffocating. Cross's chest heaved as he tried to process what was happening, his mind racing to piece together the truth. He turned to Caleb, his voice low and menacing. "Is she telling the truth?" he demanded. "Are you with her?" Caleb didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said. "You're out of your depth, Cross. This isn't your world anymore. Cross's face twisted with rage, and for a moment it looked like he might pull the trigger. But before he could act, a sudden sound shattered the silence, the distant wail of sirens, growing louder with each passing second. Cross's head snapped toward the door, his eyes widening in panic. "No," he muttered under his breath. "No, no, no." The sirens grew louder, closer, until the faint blue and red lights began to flicker through the cracks in the warehouse walls. Cross turned back to Kira and Caleb, his gun swinging wildly between the two of them. "You set me up," he growled, his voice trembling with fury. "You think you're so smart? You think you've won?" Kira met his gaze, her expression calm and resolute. "It's over, Cross," she said. "You can't outrun this." But Cross wasn't done. He grabbed the bucket of cement and tipped it over, the thick mixture spilling across the floor and splashing onto Kira's legs. She winced as the cold, heavy substance clung to her skin, but she didn't falter. "You think I'm going down alone?" Cross snarled. "I'll take you both with me." Before he could make another move, the warehouse door burst open, the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass cutting through the chaos. A team of FBI agents stormed inside, their weapons drawn and their voices booming with commands. "Drop the weapon. Hands in the air." Cross froze, his eyes darting between the agents and his captives. For a brief moment, he looked like he might fight back. But then the realization hit him he was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and completely out of options. With a furious growl, he threw the gun to the ground and raised his hands, his face twisted with rage and defeat. The agents moved in quickly, restraining him and pulling him away from Kira and Caleb. As the chaos subsided, Caleb turned to Kira, his expression a mix of relief and admiration. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. Kira nodded, though her legs ached from the cement. "I've been through worse," she said with a faint smile. The agents freed her from the chair, carefully chipping away at the cement until she was able to stand. As she stretched her legs, she glanced at Cross, who was being led away in handcuffs. His head hung low, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "It's over," Caleb said, his voice firm. Kira shook her head. "Not yet," she replied. "This is just the beginning." The warehouse was alive with chaos. Flashlights cut through the shadows as FBI agents swarmed the building, their commands echoing against the metal walls. Cross, now in handcuffs, was dragged toward the exit, his face a mask of seething rage. His eyes darted to Kira, who was being helped to her feet by Caleb. Despite her legs still coated in wet cement, she stood tall, her gaze unyielding. "This isn't over," Cross bellowed, his voice raw and desperate. "You think you've won? You don't know what you're dealing with." Kira wiped a smear of cement from her arm, her expression calm but cutting. "You're right about one thing, Cross," she said, her voice carrying over the noise. "We know exactly what we're dealing with. That's why you're in cuffs." Cross lunged forward, but the agents restrained him, forcing him back. "I'll take all of you down with me," he snarled. "You have no idea who you're messing with. You think you've exposed me? I'm just the beginning." The tension in his voice wasn't just desperation, it was a threat. Kira exchanged a glance with Caleb, her instincts telling her there was more at play. Cross wasn't just bluffing, he was buying time. "Check the truck," Kira said firmly, pointing toward the loading dock. "Whatever he's protecting, it's not just the shipment. There's something bigger here." Caleb nodded, motioning to a team of agents. They moved swiftly toward the truck Cross had been guarding earlier. As the agents approached, Cross erupted in a mocking laugh, the sound grating and unhinged. "You're too late," he shouted, his voice cracking with manic energy. "You'll never get out of here in one piece." Kira's stomach tightened as she watched the agents open the back of the truck. Inside were not only crates of smuggled goods but also several large, unmarked canisters. Caleb's face hardened as he stepped closer, inspecting the ominous containers. One of the agents examined the markings and froze, his voice tight as he called out, "We've got explosives." The word sent a chill through the warehouse. The team scrambled into action, calling for a bomb squad as the realization of Cross's true plan dawned on everyone. He wasn't just running a smuggling operation, he had rigged the entire scene as a trap. "You son of a," Caleb muttered under his breath, spinning back toward Cross. The officer's smug grin had returned, his satisfaction evident despite his restraints. "You're not walking out of here with anything," Cross sneered. "Not the evidence, not the goods. Nothing." Kira's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of Cross's plan. The explosives weren't just a safeguard, they were leverage. If triggered, they could destroy everything in the warehouse, including the evidence that tied Cross to his criminal network. It was a desperate, scorched earth tactic, but one that could still work if they didn't act fast. "We need to clear the building," Caleb shouted, motioning to the agents. "Get everyone out now." Kira stepped forward, ignoring the agents who urged her to move. Her eyes locked onto Cross, who was now being shoved toward the door. "Where's the detonator?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. Cross chuckled darkly, his expression one of twisted satisfaction. "You think I'm going to tell you?" he said. "You think you're going to walk away from this?" Kira didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her voice dropping low but forceful. "If I have to die in this warehouse to make sure you go down, I'll do it," she said. "But we both know you're not ready to pay that price." Cross's grin faltered for a split second, and Kira saw the crack she needed. "You're bluffing," he said, but the confidence in his voice wavered. "Am I?" Kira countered, stepping even closer despite the agents shouting for her to retreat. "You've been running this game for years, Cross. You're good at intimidating people, at scaring them into submission. But look around, none of that works anymore. The only way you win tonight is if you take me out with you. So go ahead. Do it." Her words hung in the air, daring him to make his move. For a moment, the warehouse seemed to hold its breath, the chaos around them fading into the background. Cross's jaw tightened, his eyes darting between Kira and the agents surrounding him. He was calculating, weighing his options. And then, just as quickly as the defiance had surged in him, it broke. "It's in the truck," Cross muttered, his voice low and bitter. "Under the driver's seat." Kira didn't waste a second. She turned to Caleb, who was already moving toward the vehicle. "I've got it," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency. The agents worked in tandem, clearing the area while Caleb climbed into the cab of the truck. He reached under the seat, his fingers brushing against a small, wired device. Pulling it free, he inspected it quickly, a simple detonator, but powerful enough to trigger the explosives in the back. "Got it," Caleb called out, holding up the device. Relief washed over Kira, but it was short-lived. As Caleb jumped out of the truck, the faint sound of a timer reached his ears. His head snapped back toward the crates, and his face paled. "There's a secondary timer," he shouted, his voice urgent. "We're out of time." Panic surged through the warehouse as the agents scrambled to evacuate. Kira turned toward Caleb, her mind racing. "Can you disable it?" she called out. Caleb hesitated for a fraction of a second, then shook his head, not without triggering it early. Kira clenched her fists, her mind working faster than ever. "Then we take the truck," she said. "We get it out of here." Caleb's eyes widened. "Are you crazy? That thing will blow." "Better out there than in here," Kira shot back. We don't have a choice. Without waiting for a response, she moved toward the truck, her legs still stiff from the cement but driven by sheer determination. Caleb followed, his face tight with worry but no hesitation in his steps. The two climbed into the cab, Caleb taking the driver's seat while Kira secured herself beside him. "You sure about this?" Caleb asked, his hands gripping the wheel. "No," Kira admitted. "But we're doing it anyway." With a roar, the truck's engine came to life, and Caleb floored the gas. The vehicle lurched forward, barreling toward the warehouse exit. Agents scrambled out of the way, shouting warnings into their radios as the truck sped into the night. Behind them, the faint beeping of the timer grew louder, a relentless reminder of how little time they had. Caleb's knuckles were white against the steering wheel as he navigated the winding roads, putting as much distance as possible between the truck and the warehouse. "Where are we going?" Caleb shouted over the roar of the engine. "Toward the river," Kira said without hesitation. "We dump it there." Caleb nodded, his focus unyielding as he pushed the truck faster. The beeping grew faster now, each pulse like a countdown to disaster. Kira's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let fear overtake her. They were close, so close. Finally, the river came into view, the dark water glinting under the moonlight. Caleb swerved onto a dirt path leading to the bank, the truck's tires skidding as they neared the edge. "Get out!" Caleb yelled, throwing the door open. Kira didn't hesitate. She jumped from the cab, landing hard on the gravel but scrambling to her feet. Caleb followed, and together they watched as the truck barreled forward, plunging into the river with a deafening splash. For a moment there was silence. Then, a massive explosion erupted beneath the surface, sending a geyser of water and debris high into the air. The shockwave knocked them back, but they stayed low, shielding themselves from the blast. When the chaos finally subsided, Kira sat up, her breathing ragged but steady. Caleb was beside her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. "You really know how to keep things interesting," he said, his voice heavy with sarcasm. Kira managed a faint smile, her eyes fixed on the rippling water where the truck had sunk. "It's not over yet," she said. "But we're close." Behind them, the sound of sirens grew louder, signaling that the backup they'd called was finally arriving. For now they had won. But the war was far from over. The sun was rising over the city, casting a pale golden hue across the buildings. The chaos of the night had settled, leaving Kira standing at the edge of the riverbank, watching the faint ripples where the truck had sunk beneath the surface. Her legs were stiff, still caked in cement, and her body ached from the adrenaline crash. But her mind remained sharp, replaying every moment of the night in vivid detail. Caleb stood a few feet away, his jacket torn and his arm in a makeshift sling, but he too was focused, his gaze fixed on the water as if expecting something to resurface. The faint hum of emergency vehicles filled the air as FBI agents and local law enforcement swarmed the area, securing the scene and cataloguing the remnants of the operation they had dismantled. For now, it was over. But Kira knew it was only the beginning. The senior agent approached, his face a mix of relief and frustration. "Williamsmore," he began, addressing them with a tone of measured authority. "Good work out there, but we've got a mess to clean up. That explosion could have taken out half the team." He paused, glancing toward the river. "You took a hell of a risk." Kira's voice was steady despite her exhaustion. "It was the only option," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Cross was ready to take everything down with him. We didn't have time to disarm the secondary trigger. The truck had to go. The agent sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I get it, but now we're dealing with scraps." Whatever was in that truck is gone, and we're left with a disgraced cop who may or may not talk. Kira looked over her shoulder, spotting Cross being loaded into a transport vehicle. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes still burned with defiance. He wasn't beaten yet, at least not entirely. She turned back to the agent. "He'll talk," she said with quiet certainty. "He's too scared not to. He knows the people he worked for won't protect him now." The agent frowned but nodded, his trust in her judgment evident despite his reservations. "We'll see. For now, get yourselves cleaned up. I want your full debriefing by 0900. Kira exchanged a glance with Caleb as the agent walked away. His smirk was faint but familiar, a reminder that even in moments of exhaustion, he never lost his sense of humor. "You've got a knack for making friends," he said, leaning slightly against the nearby railing. "Comes with the job," Kira replied, her lips twitching in the semblance of a smile. "And speaking of the job, don't think I didn't see you dive headfirst into that truck. What were you thinking?" "That I didn't want to get blown up," Caleb said with a shrug. "And maybe that you'd owe me dinner for saving your ass." Kira shook her head, but her smile grew. The banter was a welcome reprieve from the weight of the night's events. Still, her mind didn't rest. Cross's words echoed in her head, his taunts about being just a cog in a larger machine. It wasn't just bluster, she could see it in his eyes. He was afraid of something, or someone, and that fear was a weapon they could use. But it also meant the fight was far from over. By the time they reached the field office, the sun was fully up, casting harsh light over the building's concrete exterior. Kira and Caleb were escorted inside, past bustling agents and analysts poring over files and data collected from the operation. The energy in the room was electric victory tinged with the urgency of steps. The senior agent was already waiting for them in the briefing room, a thick file open on the table in front of him. "Here's what we know," he began without preamble. Cross wasn't exaggerating about the size of this network. The shipment wasn't just contraband, it was part of a larger pipeline stretching across state and international borders. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking, it's all connected. Kira leaned forward, her focus sharpening. "What about Cross himself? Did he give us anything useful?" The agent shook his head. "Not yet. He's playing coy, hoping someone higher up will intervene. But we've isolated him. He has no way of contacting anyone outside our control. It's only a matter of time before he realizes he's on his own." Caleb crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "And when he does, what then? He's a mid-level player at best. If the people running this operation decide he's a liability, they won't let him live long enough to talk." The agent didn't deny it. Instead, he turned to Kira. "That's why we need to act fast. If Cross is our way into the upper echelons of this network, we can't afford to waste time." "What did you see last night? Anything that points to who's really pulling the strings?" Kira thought back to the warehouse, the crates, the hastily concealed canisters. Every detail felt important, a piece of the puzzle they were trying to solve. "The explosives," she said finally. "They weren't just there to destroy evidence. They were a message. Whoever's running this isn't afraid to burn everything down if it means staying hidden." The agent nodded grimly. "That tracks with what we've uncovered so far. These people don't leave loose ends, which means we're already on borrowed time." As the debriefing continued, Kira's mind kept drifting back to Cross's final words. "You've been chasing shadows. It wasn't just bravado, it was a clue. The network was vast, intricate, and deliberately designed to mislead investigators. But shadows couldn't exist without light, and Kira was determined to find its source." After the meeting, Caleb caught up with her in the hallway. You're thinking about going after them, aren't you? He asked, though it wasn't really a question. Kira glanced at him, her expression unreadable. We don't have a choice. If we don't press now, they'll regroup, and we'll lose the advantage. Caleb sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I figured you'd say that. Guess I'll need another sling by the time this is over. She allowed herself a small smile. You're not getting out of this that easily. That evening, Kira sat alone on her porch, the city skyline glowing faintly in the distance. The exhaustion of the day weighed heavily on her, but her mind refused to rest. The investigation had taken months to reach this point, and yet the deeper they dug, the more labyrinthine it became. Cross was right about one thing. They were chasing shadows. But shadows couldn't hide forever. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She picked it up, her expression hardening as she read the message from Caleb New Lead. We're moving fast. Be ready. She set the phone down, staring out at the skyline. The war wasn't over. It might never truly be over, but for now they had struck a blow. The network was reeling, and they had the momentum. This time they wouldn't just chase shadows, they would drag them into the light, piece by piece, until nothing was left.